You don't have to have that handout. It's just some notes, sort of an outline I'm going to try to follow as we delve into a new hot topic. I wanted to talk about human sexuality because of all the controversy and confusion that there seems to be in today's American culture. Here it is, the Olympics, and one of the great Olympians, Bruce Jenner, is now Caitlyn Jenner. And there's been a lot said about that over the past couple of years. Yeah, still got the transgender bathrooms in Target. There's just all kinds of stuff going on that it's a crazy world. And we have been very fortunate that it hasn't been crazier than it is, because it is the world. And I keep reminding myself of that, and I feel obliged to remind you as a brother in Christ that this is the world. Yes, it's the United States of America, but it is still the world, and the devil reigns here, and he is making his influence known everywhere people will let him, and there just seem to be a whole lot more people letting him these days than there have been in the past. At any rate, we're not jumping right into this outline tonight is kind of a basis for human sexuality as the Bible teaches us. We're not jumping right into the hot controversies right away. But we can, as we look at this, we can discuss a lot of things as they have to do with it. But we're starting in Genesis chapter 1, where we read of God's creation of Adam and Eve. And what it says in chapter 26 is that he created them male and female in his image. And up to this point, he has created all other life. Every land creature has already been created. Every sea creature has been created. Everything that flies in the air, all the bugs, all the spiders, everything that there is that lives has been created. All the plants even that also reproduce sexually based. But sex has never entered into it, except for the fact that God has continually, repeatedly said that everything reproduces in a certain way. How did God say everything would reproduce? After its kind. And he repeated that, I believe, 7 times, or was it 10 times? I think it was 10 times he repeated that. Yeah, once is enough, but when God tells you something repeatedly, he doesn't waste words. And so when he says something repeatedly, I'm sure he's trying to make a point with us that everything reproduces after its kind. Which, incidentally, a little side note, if evolution is true, then that natural law has to be stricken. Because rather than things reproducing after their kind, they have to keep reproducing new kinds. New kinds, and new kinds, and new kinds, and change kinds, and different kinds. It's almost as if God could see this false teaching of evolution coming down the pike. It's almost as if he knew that was going to happen. And so he puts in the creation account that everything reproduces after its kind. Now that's true physically, but it's also true spiritually. You can't plant bad spiritual seed and get a good spiritual crop. It's true in every aspect of life. With every action, there is what? An equal and opposite reaction. And that's one of the laws of nature, and it's a spiritual law as well. All right, with that observation in Genesis 1:26 that he has made human beings male and female, we're introduced to this idea of male and female. I'm sorry, verse 27. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And I like to point out that man is created in the image of God, but so is woman. Both are created in the image of God, and they are male and female, which means they are made to go together. There is a purpose for that, and they're instructed at this point to do what? Among other things, to be fruitful and multiply. So there's supposed to be a reproduction coming from this sexuality. It's not limited to that, as we'll find later in several other passages of Scripture, but that's definitely one of the functions of human sexuality. Now, the specifics of how male and female were created is in chapter 2. You may hear somebody claim that there are two completely different accounts of creation. Well, not really. Chapter 1 gives us the general overall view account of creation, and chapter 2 gives us the specifics. And they do this in movies all the time. You'll be watching a movie and it'll give you some big event taking place, and then they'll show you the things that led up to that big event or one person's part in that big event, and that's kind of what God is doing here in chapters 1 and 2. Gives us the overall view of creation in chapter 1, and then he gets to the specifics in chapter 2. Took a handful of dirt, verse 7 of chapter 2, formed man, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and he became a living being. So man was created first. Paul will come back to this fact in 1 Timothy, that the man was created first. And so God created the man, from Paul's statement, to be the leader, to be the one that takes the reins and goes forward. And why was the woman created? As a helpmeet, because it was not good that man should be alone. And any woman who's left her man alone for any length of time knows that's true. When you get back, place is a mess, and everything else is in disarray. Men need help, and God's observed that. That's the first thing he said about the creation account that was not good. Everything else up to this time has been good, but he said, man, it's not good for man to be alone. We got to get somebody to help him. So he made the woman and brought them together. And it's not about competition. In the world, it's always about competition. Who's going to get one up? It's not even about equality. A lot of people vying for equality. Equal rights this, equal rights that. God's message to us about humanity is that it's about unity. Unity is always the focus in the eyes of God. That's what Jesus prayed for in John chapter 7. What was he always arguing with the apostles about that they were discussing among themselves? Who was the greatest? Who's the greatest in the kingdom? Who's the greatest among these apostles? No, it's not about that. That's not the question. And so when we come to the creation account, when people look for one to have a leg up on the other, that's the wrong way to look at it. It's about unity. And God is trying to teach us that right off the bat, so to speak. In the end of chapter 2, what does it say about man and woman and their self-consciousness? Now, why would God tell us that? Is there a point to that? Okay, this is on the backside of sin entering into the world. This is before sin. And before sin, the man and his wife were naked, and they were not ashamed. There was no reason for them to have clothing in the garden for the sake of modesty. There wasn't even need for them to have clothing for the sake of briars, because briars hadn't come into the picture yet. No poison ivy, none of that stuff. They didn't need the clothes because everything was great, and then they sinned, and now they're naked, and they know it. And that's interesting to read in chapter 3. Eve eats the fruit, and she gives it to her husband, and he eats in verse 6. And what does verse 7 tell us? Their eyes were opened. Does that mean that they couldn't see before this? Okay. And we might call this the same thing we hear it called sometimes these days, although it's not used as much because I suppose it's not used because it's such a prevalent thing in today's culture. But there used to be the phraseology, carnal knowledge. I think there might have even been a movie called Carnal Knowledge. Ooh, and we all know what that is. Yes?
Do they also comprehend all forms and types of sin that God had put in front of them?
I don't know what they comprehended at this point, except that they were naked, if they even understood what that meant. But they just knew, and God is putting this in here for us, that there's some reason why he tells us at the end of chapter 2 they were naked and there was no shame. Then they eat the fruit that's been forbidden, that's the knowledge of good and evil, and now they are ashamed and they're naked. Have they done anything as far as their nakedness or their sexuality. Well, no, they haven't done a thing. They just ate the fruit, and they're looking at each other like, oh, man, you're naked. Well, you're naked too. What are we going to do? What did they do? Okay.
Before that, the serpent told the woman that the fruit was good. She saw the tree, the fruit. How'd she see it? Her eyes weren't already open.
Oh, okay. He's talking in a figurative sense, that there were things they didn't see. Like when we talk about children today, there are things that kids just don't see, they don't understand. And so we understand it because we have come of age, so to speak. But they could see with their eyes. They saw the fruit. She saw the devil. She saw and heard everything about the fruit. It was pleasing to her eyes. But when she ate, then she knew, and she saw in a way. Just like when Jesus was talking to the Pharisees. It says, having eyes, you see, but because you don't see, you're guilty. So this idea of nakedness has come up a second time.
I think that's similar to the Old Testament and the Mosaic law, the law that could keep, Jews could not keep to 100%. And guilty of anything but the law, guilty of the whole law.
Right.
And I think that's where they became aware of it, that they violated God's word in a way that the laws of Moses violated. And their eyes were open to the fact that it said that they did the wrong thing.
Pandora's box is a popular story based on this idea that everything was fine until somebody opened the box, and once they opened the box, everything bad came out of the box, and then everything was messed up after that. And that fairly well illustrates what we're looking at here. I don't know what exactly it must have been like prior to the eating of the fruit. Everything was wholesome, everything was pure, everything was clean. And even when Paul writes later, he will say, to the pure, what? All things are pure. But those who are defiled, and you can see this in life. And Jay Leno, y'all remember Jay Leno? He said, and he made this point. He said, people can take anything and make something dirty out of it. And he said, let me just give you an example. And he took some of the most common phrases that we use every single day, and he just said them in a way that you knew, oh, he means something dirty by that. Well, what's the deal? Where was I going with that? Yeah. And we're inclined towards that. And yeah, initial innuendo and then double innuendo and double entendre. Of course, that's really bad because it's French. So, and those of you who have had little girls and had little boys, how many of you have had little boys and little girls? Are the boys different from the little girls? I'm not talking about the way they're made. I'm talking about the things they gravitate towards. We've made that observation, having had 2 daughters and a son. There's something about little boys that very early on they notice things that little girls don't. They're made differently. Why is it that when you're going down the road and you look at the mud flaps on the back of an 18-wheeler, you might see some mud flaps that are chrome silhouettes of naked women? There are a lot of lady truckers on the road, but you never see silhouettes of naked men on the mud flaps of any lady truck driver. Maybe in California. You can probably see them on a man's truck in California. But my point is that we're different from birth and long before birth in the things that we pay attention to. And what they were paying attention to after eating this fruit, whatever knowledge it gave them, they knew that now they're naked. And even though their actions haven't changed sexually, they know they can't be naked. And so they make clothes and they put those clothes on. What's that? Sure. But I don't know if that claim could be substantiated, that only women could commit adultery.
Yes, it was. I'm on the internet a lot, and in fact, it says at this time in the Jewish, Hebrew history.
Well, when you look at Abraham,
I don't think it was ever okay with God, though.
well, of course
What
not.
Jesus said.
Now, culturally, whatever culture might do, that might be one thing, but
Adultery, even from all over the world, who gives
in
the lady that was caught in the very act of adultery, and they go over there, they caught her, what they do is the man, oh, he got away.
well, yeah, but that's what Johnny's saying, that culturally there might be some situation. And Islam is probably that way today.
Goes all the way back 1500 years.
But as far as God's concerned, and when Abram had a little thing with where is that here? Abimelech. I think his name was Abimelech, King Abimelech. Yeah.
One more tiny point on this.
Okay.
When Jesus wrote down on the ground, and he says, whoever casts the first stone, whoever is innocent casts the first stone, the subject at hand was adultery.
Right.
Every one of those character men, they had already committed adultery, and they was nailed.
No, you can't say
That's the
that.
reason they left.
Well, that would be hard to substantiate. You can make that claim.
The subject at hand was adultery.
Sure.
And he said, would you
He that didn't sin.
But still, assumption, he said without sin.
Right.
Yeah, without sin.
He could
But
have
the
said-
subject at hand was adultery.
But you're still, it's still an
Down here,
assumption.
our cake.
Yes.
In Mark 10:11, Jesus is the one speaking, and he said, whosoever shall put away his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she herself shall put away her husband and marry another, she commits adultery. That's very clear on Christ's part, that both can commit adultery.
Right. In chapter 21, let's see, and I may. This isn't it. It's got to be back. I was thinking chapter 14, but I didn't find it there. Oh, chapter 12. It's all the way back to chapter 12. In Genesis chapter 12, I'm sorry, Genesis 12. So we're talking in that same early time frame. And even though Genesis is included in the law, it was written giving us a history of things that took place long before the law. Let's see, verse 10. Genesis 12:10. There was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it came about when he came near to Egypt that he said to Sarai his wife, now I know that you're a beautiful woman, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. They will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say that you're my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that I may live on account of you. Came about when Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Therefore he treated Abram well for her sake, and gave him sheep and oxen and donkeys, and male and female servants, and female donkeys and camels. But the Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Then Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this that you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here's your wife. Take her and go. In other words, Pharaoh was saying, if I'd have known she was your wife, I wouldn't have done that, because I know, even as Pharaoh, he's saying, I know that that's not wrong or right. There was another account, similarly, with another king I was thinking, and he said the same thing, that how come you didn't tell me she was your wife? Is it 20? Yes. Those are the two, all right. Verse 8, Genesis 20, verse 8. Abimelech arose early in the morning and called all his servants and told all these things in their hearing, and the men were greatly affrighted. And then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us, and how have I sinned against you, that you've brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? You've done to me things that ought not to be done." And Abimelech said to Abraham, "What have you encountered that you have done this thing?" And Abraham said, "Because I thought, surely there's no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is actually my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife." So I was really telling you the truth. But what stands out to me in both these accounts is that here was a Pharaoh, a king of Egypt, and here's Abimelech, another king, and they both recognized the sin not only of adultery, but they recognized the sin of murder. Abram was afraid that they would kill him to take his wife, and these guys said, "We wouldn't do that, but we wouldn't take your wife either because you're married to her." And I'm impressed with this, and I'm impressed because of other things we'll read probably in just a little bit about the nature of the Canaanites and their practices, both religiously and sexually. At any rate, so there was that kind of knowledge there at that point. In chapter 4, wait a minute, did we cover, oh yeah, chapter 3, 6 through 8. We looked at that and how sin helps us see our nakedness. Chapter 4 of Genesis. Verse 17, Cain had relations with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. And he built a city and called the name of that city Enoch after the name of his son. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad became the father of Mehujael, and Mehujael became the father of Methushael. Methushael became the father of Lamech. Lamech did what in verse 19? He took to him 2 wives. This is the first account in Scripture of, we're in chapter 4 of Genesis. First time we see a man taking more than one wife for himself. Somewhere in here in my notes, I make the point that God never condones that. He never approves of that, but it was a pretty common practice. Abraham, of course, would also later take Hagar unto himself after Sarai's urging. Why did she urge Abram to take Hagar to wife? Yes, they wanted to have a child. She couldn't give him one. Well, here, take Hagar and have a child by her. And God didn't stop that. He never said, "No, you can't do that." But the results of that are, and I say this with some degree of not contempt, no. Some degree of, I'm reticent to make too much of a claim. But from Ishmael came the Ishmaelites, or the Arabs. And who've been at war with God's people since that day but the Arabs? And it occurs to me that if Abram, I'm not trying to lay blame on Abram, I'm just trying to make an observation that can help me in my decision-making process. Call it a process. If Abram had said, "I'm not going to do this with Hagar because God had said, you and me. I'm waiting for God to give you and me a child." If Abram had waited, Ishmael would not have come into the picture, and the trouble that's in the world now between the Arabs and the Israelites wouldn't be here. But Abram didn't wait. Now, here's another thing. Don't call me sexist for this, but who took the lead in that situation? Sarah did. Maybe there's another lesson in here for us. Men, we need to step up to the plate. Not step up to the plate to lord it over our wives, but step up to the plate to be the ones in our homes that say, "I'm responsible to take the lead spiritually. And I'm going to do it. And here's what we're going to do spiritually." Rather than that falling onto the shoulders of the woman who was not intended, not designed to take the spiritual lead in a family. When that has to happen, it's tragic. And a woman is a better spiritual leader than no spiritual leader, but that's not the way it's supposed to be in the family. And when things don't go the way they're supposed to go because us men let our responsibilities slide, well, we can expect that things aren't going to be as good as they could be. And you thought this was just going to be a lesson on sexuality. But that's part of it. That's part of it. All right, back to chapter 4 with Lamech. Lamech took to himself 2 wives. He's the first polygamist. And bless you, Gesundheit, all that stuff. And then it says, verse 23, Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, listen to my voice, you wives of Lamech, give heed to my speech. I've killed a man for wounding me, and a boy for striking me. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, then Lamech is avenged how? 77-fold. It is as if this offspring of Cain is being billed for us as the one who is now introducing violence into the world and vengeance. And by the time we get to chapter 6, God says, I'm going to destroy the world, not just because every imagination of the thoughts of their heart is evil always continually, but twice in chapter 6, God will mention violence. Violence. So here we've got a man, he's the first guy to take 2 wives to himself. He's also a guy that God is pointing out, this is a guy who's going to avenge himself, and he's not just going to avenge himself for justice, he's going to avenge himself 77 times what he thinks he's owed. So, and there's another picture of the Mideast. If people would just lay down their arms and say, let's just stop this craziness, there could be peace, but it won't happen. Well, either way, and I think it was President of Israel said, if the Arabs would lay down their arms, there would be peace. If we would lay down our arms, there would be no more Israel. That's pretty much the way it is. All right, Genesis 6, 1 through 7. This is a very interesting text. I don't want to make too much of this, but I want to introduce you to some things that other biblical writers say to see what the potential is here. What it says is, it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God did what? Oh man, these girls are beautiful. Let's grab us some. Let's get us some wives. Woo, let's go out and get some women. Woohoo! And they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Now, I don't mean to read too much into that. But what that doesn't say is that they took marriage as a very serious commitment and they were careful in their choice of women who would help them lead their families to God. That's not what that says. And what does the next verse say? Right. My spirit won't always strive with man because he is flesh. And that's what we just read in verses 1 and 2. That looks like the flesh taking charge. We got some beautiful girls. Let's grab us up some women. And God says, my spirit's not going to strive with these guys always, but his days are going to be 120 years. Now, who are the sons of God? If you look in Job, the first chapter of Job, I should have marked it so it wouldn't take me so long to get there. It says in chapter 1 and verse 6, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. This looks to me like the sons of God are not simply men, but are some beings that have fellowship with God and an audience with God, and Satan is among them, not necessarily appear, but possibly appear. So this is that use of the phrase in Job 1 of sons of God. And here we've got that phrase in Genesis 6, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men. It doesn't say that the sons of God saw that the daughters of the sons of God. It says the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Now, when we read about that, then we read verse 3 that we did a while ago about God saying, my spirit's not always going to strive with man, he's flesh. And it says in verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. And the Nephilim, we don't know a whole lot about them, but it is thought that they were a large race. And we know there were giants. We know giant Goliath, 9.5 feet tall by the measurements provided for us in 1 Samuel. 9.5 is a pretty good sized guy, and he wasn't one of these 9.5 feet people that you might see at the circus who is just really tall, who usually has a lot of health issues, but Goliath was a scary soldier. He wore armor that weighed 160 pounds. You don't wear 160 pounds worth of armor when you're a tall, spindly guy who's just out of proportion. He carried a spear. I forget how much the spear weighed, but I think his helmet was 20 pounds. So we're talking about, a 20-pound helmet, 160 pounds worth of armor on his body, a spear that was like a weaver's staff. Big guy and a healthy guy. So maybe that's who this guy is. Now, when you go back to Jude, and I really wish there was more detailed information on this. We're just kind of putting a few things together. Let's see here. Jude verse 5. Now I desire to remind you, though you know all things once for all, that the Lord, after saving a people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who did not believe, and angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, he has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Well, what did those angels do? And then it says in verse 7, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they in the same way as these did what? Indulged in gross immorality and went after what? Strange flesh. What strange flesh? We know in the context of Sodom and Gomorrah, strange flesh is men having sex with men. That's not supposed to happen. That is strange to the ways of God. I'm thinking that what Jude is telling us is that those angels came down and they had sex with women, strange flesh, because angels aren't supposed to come down and have sex with women, and that's where the Nephilim came from. Somehow angels apparently took human form, had children with these women, and they became the Nephilim, the giants. And some of that gene pool must have made it through the flood, because it's on the other side of the flood that we find Goliath and his brothers. There are just a lot of questions. And in the past, I used to think to myself, I can't wait to get to heaven and ask God about these things. But now that I'm getting older, I'm thinking, when I get to heaven, I ain't going to care about none of this stuff anymore. I don't care. I'm in heaven. Woohoo! I don't need these questions answered. And I have an idea that all of them are going to already be answered in our minds. We'll have perfect knowledge somehow. I don't know that the learning process is going to still be with us in heaven. That's another thing that we could talk about and discuss, but find no permanent answer for. Anyway, I just wanted you to see these things. And Peter mentions that in 2 Peter chapter 2 a little bit as well. Dagan?
Might be good to drop in here the thought that there is no male or female as to soul and spirit.
Okay.
If you have a male who wants to become a female or vice versa, they change the body, but inside that body is still the same soul and spirit. Now, if you add that to 1 Corinthians 2:11, who among men knoweth the things of a man, save the spirit of man that is in him? Our
Sure.
their impulses are. But I know this, that the spirit, when the doctor gets through, is still the same one. And it's some type, devilish or divine influence producing, guiding that thinking.
And they can get by with it in
With the problem.
in today's culture. You can get by with that because we're supposed to be tolerant of everything. And if somebody says, well, I know I look like a man, but I'm really a woman, or vice versa, well, you can't disagree with them. I like what one guy did. I can't recall every stipulation he made, but it went something like this, and you'll be able to see it easily from what I can remember about what he said. He was on a college campus, and he just asked some young people, he said, do you think there's any difference between male and a female? And, oh, no, there's no difference between a male and a female. Because that's what they're taught these days. Bless their hearts. I pray for our young people. They're being raised in an environment. It's just insane. Anyway, okay, so there's no difference between men and women. Well, what if I told you that I'm really a woman? And this is a pretty virile-looking guy standing there. I said, well, I guess if you think you're a woman, you must be a woman. Okay, well, what if I told you I was a Chinese woman? Well, okay, well, I guess you might have some Chinese genes, and maybe they're just not coming through. And you could have Chinese blood, and you just not look Chinese. Okay, well, what if I told you I was a 6'5" Chinese woman? They said, well, now you're just being stupid now, kind of a thing. Well, why? Because, well, I can look at you and I can say, you're not 6'5". Well, so can't you look at me and see I'm not a Chinese? Can't you look at me and tell I'm not a woman? And it was like, oh, okay. So the external things are being pushed aside by so many people for claims that are being made about what's internal. And what's happening is when people are telling us, well, this is out of respect for people's view of their own sexuality. No, it's in disrespect of God's creation of sexuality. Another guy put it this way. The problem with racism is that you assume that your color is more sacred than another person's color. Where does color come from? Well, it comes from the genes that God put in humanity initially. We all get our genetics from our parents. We don't have anything to do with that. It just comes to us. And he says, since it's from God, it is sacred, and it's assigned to everyone. If you're white by the grace of God. If you are black by the grace of God. If you're brown or yellow or red, whatever your skin color, whatever your nationality, your race, that is by the grace of God, and we should all consider that sacred and not demean or diminish anybody's race. Why don't we hold that same truth sexually? Why don't we say that if you're a woman, you're a woman? And to demean your womanness, your femininity, by claiming to be a man or trying to be a man, you're eliminating the sacred. You're crossing over. And that's one of the problems with the way we see things. We don't see things logically and reasonably. If you're a man or a woman, that's from God. It's not anything you chose. You have that from God, and it is sacred. Dayton?
Also, doesn't the problems fade away in Galatians 3:27? There can be neither Jew nor Greek, bond or free, male or female. You're all one in Christ Jesus. I'm just saying that we are making a distinction that the spiritual pattern Christ presented to his people would clear up racial, whatever would be the bond and free pattern and male-female problem. We are all one in Christ.
Sure, if we understood it in its context. But you know as well as I do, the people today are now using that passage to say that women ought to be allowed to be shepherds and deacons and leaders in the church because there is no male and female according to Galatians chapter 3, and they're pulling it completely out of context. Which is exactly what will be done with any passage of Scripture. If God says it, the devil will try to change it. Don?
You gotta remember, also God put in amongst all of this,
The what?
the God put it in our sacred book.
The Klan, C-L-A-N. Oh, the Ku Klux Klan.
They're saying white is better than black. Brown is better. Black is better. Who put that in?
Well, it wasn't God.
God didn't put that in. It's a survival.
Hey, Marty, one good scripture that, it just seems to hit it for me is in Romans chapter 1, verse 28. It says, "And because they did not think it worthwhile to acknowledge God, God delivered them over to a worthless mind to do what is morally wrong." And so that seems to kind of epitomize exactly what's going on. Our society has thrown God out. We threw the moral compass out with it, and so we're left for whoever has the biggest microphone to dictate to the rest of us what's morally right, what's morally wrong. And we talked about, men identifying as women and vice versa, but that's not even the end. That's not even the edge of the depravity. We're already starting to see groups that now they identify as dogs, and they want to be acknowledged as, like, this is how this is how I feel. And it's like, well, where does it end, So
Right. And it won't end.
that verse just seems to hit it for me. It's like, yeah, okay, you take me out of the picture, he just lets them go on to their own,
Until a line is drawn in the sand and somebody says, we're going to enforce this line and it's not going any farther. That's one of the reasons why you got to respect some world leaders. For example, Putin. He says to the Muslims, you want to come in our country, you're going to be a Russian. You're not going to come in here and bring Islam and adopt Sharia law. You want to come here because we don't need you. You need us. If you come here, you adopt our ways. Nothing wrong with that. That's perfectly reasonable. Who would you allow to come into your home and say how things are going to be run in your home? Nobody. Anyway, we've had 2 bells. So we'll come back to this, Lord willing, next week.